When Triumph Motorcycles of Hinckley created their first sport touring bike, it had 3 cylinders, was 100 horsepower, so they claimed, and it was back in 1990. So 100 horsepower back then was absolutely astronomical power, especially in something that looked like this. The Trident, however, lacked all of the creature comforts we've come to know and expect from a sport touring bike. It didn't have a power windscreen, or any windscreen for that matter. It lacked luggage and a whole host of fairing that we expect to have now to keep us somewhat dry when riding in the rain. It didn't take long for Triumph to start moving forward, and a year later they introduced the Sprint, or as it was known then, the Trident Sprint. Now this bike had a half fairing and a bit of a windscreen, and was basically the same as the original Trident, as it was based on the same platform. Using the same platform to make 2 different motorcycles is how modern manufacturing gives the consumers a choice, or at least the perception of choice, and supposedly still stay profitable. Enter the 21st century, and Triumph between 2010 and 2014 did something uniquely British. They gave their consumers a choice of a Sprint ST, which had been redesigned in 2005 around the 1050 Triple, the engine that you'll see in the Speed 3. Plus, they gave consumers the GT option. Why was this uniquely British? Well, if you don't like the sport touring, let's throw a few £1,000s at this bike and you'll sure to love the Grand Tour. So you guessed it, they're pretty much the same bike. So why are we talking about machines that have been out of production since 2017? Well, the Sprint was really poorly marketed in North America. It didn't make a whole lot of sense at the time. It's also extremely overlooked when it comes to the pre-owned market. And that's really what we're talking about today, is picking up one of these bikes pre-owned and realizing how good of a bike they actually are. So this is our tale of 2 Sprints. I saw my first Sprint GT back in 2011 when it first came out, and I was actually really surprised by that bike. I didn't even know Triumph made a sport tour, or that it looked this good. Plus, they had been doing it for 6 years prior to that.
The Sprint is, well, European in its general appeal, designed for varying weather, quick acceleration on winding roads, followed by a blast down the Autobahn, where the limit is your nerve and how far you can twist that right hand. It didn't grab the attention of the majority of North Americans, who have the luxury of long, straight roads with no displacement restrictions on their license or insurance, and for many, the highlights of the ride is swerving for the odd errant gopher.
Now, the Sprint didn't come with power windshields or even heated grips or fancy electronic suspension, but what it did come with is an absolutely brilliant engine.
I think it's brilliant.
The Triumph 1050 Triple is everything that you could possibly want out of a street motorcycle engine.
The early Sprint produced 123 brake horsepower and 77 foot-pounds torque at a relatively low 5,000 RPM. That means you don't really have to worry about what gear you're in or if you're out of position in a particular lane. Just twist the throttle and go. So not really as perceptible by the seat of your pants were the changes made to the Sprint GT. This bike produces 128 brake horsepower and claimed 80 foot-pounds torque. Now this torque is generating its peak at around 6,300 RPM, which is surprising because for a touring bike, you typically want to have that torque coming on lower in the RPM range. Not so with the Sprint GT. Now that doesn't take away from the ride of the Sprint GT, however. In fact, this bike is imperceptibly faster than the ST, or at least it is for me. And the comfort and ride is dramatically improved. One of the disadvantages of the ST is how quickly the front end will elevate, particularly when accelerating hard. The GT is much smoother and much more predictable, both in cornering and hard acceleration. Now, I'm not a professional drag racer, but the ST is almost a second slower off the start than the GT. The ST front wheel floats down the first 100 meters as you lose contact with the pavement, while the longer GT just allowed for more abrupt and harder throttle than the ST, or so it was in my experience with them.
Overall, the GT is 6 inches longer than the ST, and who couldn't use an extra 6 inches? The extra length translates into a more comfortable seat for both the rider and passenger. And along with the longer tail section and swing arm, that meant you could have bigger panniers. The panniers on the GT are the same as the ones Triumph used on the Trophy SE. And the panniers on the ST were a dealer-installed option, and these panniers were found on virtually every Triumph in the late 2000s. Which means if you ever have to replace one, it's pretty easy because this pannier was on the Tiger and a bunch of other bikes. The downside is only one of these panniers will hold a helmet. The fuel injection system on both Sprints is fairly spot on, what you would expect in a Triumph 1050. However, in 2007, with the Sprint, they upgraded the engine control module as well as some fuel injection system components, and that is noticeable on this 2006 model, which would have benefited from the upgrades. The suspension system is also surprisingly good on both models. The GT did get heavier springs up front and a preload adjustment on the rear monoshock that had a wheel on it, as opposed to the ST, which required you to get off the bike and use your screwdriver in order to dial in the preload. Like I said, there is an adjustment in the ST for preload, but you definitely have to be off your bike and get the toolkit out every time you want to tweak things, as opposed to the manual wheel on the monoshock for the GT, which is a lot easier to adjust, particularly if you're picking a passenger up or you decided to head down some twisty roads and want to stiffen up the suspension just a little bit. The front forks on both these Triumphs is easily adjusted with preload directly from the top. Now, I do want to call out the fact that these are conventional style forks, and yet they work, providing you set them up properly, exceptionally well. The traditional slider on top and tube on the bottom is typically a result of the manufacturer trying to save a little bit of money. And that's exactly what Triumph is doing here. Not the inverted forks that you'll find on the Daytona or the Speed Triple. If you're going out and buying a Sprint, plan on replacing the fork seals at some point in time. Better yet, just take the forks out and rebuild them. And that'll allow you to ensure that you have proper oil balance in each side, and your ride will be dramatically improved with these forks. The valving and the springs in the forks, in particular the GT, make up for the lack of technology in the overall front suspension system. So while we're talking about the front suspension, that naturally leads us to the brakes. And probably the most warranted and single most common complaint about the Sprint. The brakes are pretty much garbage. So for a bike that can accelerate the way this bike does and achieve the speeds that it does, particularly with a passenger, the brakes pull like a professional Mercy finger fighter and really don't inspire any confidence in the rider at all, particularly in a panic stop, despite the ABS. What this bike really needs is the Brembo upgrade that the Speed 3 and Daytona receive. That would absolutely change the landscape for this bike. The biggest complaint out of the way, we'll talk about a few minor ones. I mentioned earlier that the ride position is more sport than tour. What I mean by that is it has a fairly aggressive lean angle in your position of your body stretched out over the tank. This would be fine if I were 6 feet tall and could reach out that far. Just to clarify, I'm not. But if I were 6 feet tall, I might be able to ride the bike a little more easily without a strained neck or wrist, but I might be a little concerned about the high foot peg height. The foot pegs are not rounded like a sport bike is, and they're in a flat position relative to the ground. What this means is that if you are leant over, you can find the pegs a little bit uncomfortable. The foot peg placement on the Sprint is similar to what you'll see in the Speed Triple. And this high foot peg placement is okay for my 30-inch inseam. And it probably would be marginally comfortable if you had up to a 32-inch inseam. But 34 and beyond, you're probably going to be looking at a completely different bike altogether, as this would probably be unbearable. But that is the price you pay when you're freakishly tall. To alleviate the aggressive seating position, I use some inexpensive aftermarket riser blocks. And these blocks are placed over the forks between the handlebars and the triple tree. They move the handlebar up about 1.5 inches. And really, that's all you need to be comfortable and ride the bike for 6 to 8 hours straight. And believe me, I have.
So something not terribly obvious on the ST version, if you're looking at one, is the fact that the seat doesn't release with a key like it does on the GT or practically any other motorcycle in the market. In fact, the seat only comes off by removing 2 bolts which are located at the back of the seat. What this means is you're constantly tugging on the fabric here in the back of the seat. And if you're looking at purchasing one, be sure to check that out. I would pretty much guarantee that the seat cover has torn loose from the seat pan as a result of the necessity to tug and tear in order to get at those bolts. Now, I don't know what the Triumph engineers were thinking when they came up with this seat design. In fact, if you were lucky enough to find one with a passenger pillion cover, you'll note that it bolts into the side of the seat through these holes right here. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And of course, also what this means is that there's no storage underneath the seat. And from time to time, you may need to go down there. There's important stuff under that seat, like, I don't know, maybe the battery? So a battery tender lead is an absolute must for the Sprint ST.
So one final issue to point out is that the transmission on this engine is kind of clunky, particularly in upshifts. Now, I've had a few 1050s and ridden some other Triumphs and have found that that's pretty common in this bike, regardless of how old it is or what year it is. So when it comes to shifting up, best to power shift through the gears if you can, and sparingly use the clutch when downshifting. So these are the gripes about the bike. But what are some of the virtues? Well, the Sprint always came standard with a center stand on the bike. A center stand is one of the most valuable tools you can have, particularly in the absence of a shoplift. The center stand also allows you to get the tank perfectly level, allowing you to top off, particularly when you may have missed your last option to fuel or are going on a particularly long stretch down a section of highway you're unsure of.
The wind and rain protection is also good, or at least as good as any other sport tour. Seat comfort, easy to use switches, gauges, and fitment are all typical high-quality Triumph.
So you've made it this far into the video, and it means you're probably seriously considering buying one of these bikes, or you're just a dedicated Triumph fan, either of which is fine. There are a number of videos on our channel that feature these bikes, so you might want to just take a moment and click like and subscribe and access these videos, as if you plan on owning one in the future or you already own a Triumph, I guarantee these videos will come in handy. So part of the reason I'm investing my time today talking to you about a motorcycle that's been out of production since 2017 is the general state of affairs of the motorcycle industry and their current offerings. So it appears that much like modern politics, modern motorcycle manufacturing has broken up their lines into very distinct and separate factions. Factions where there's really no room for compromise or crossover. Take, for example, the sport touring party, which has pretty much gone by the wayside. Take a look at Triumph's current offerings. You have the adventure line, the naked bike segment, and of course the classic line of standard bikes like the Bonneville and Thruxton. Even the Daytona this year is a limited special edition, making them less plentiful in every dealer's showroom. So what happened to Triumph? As a former Triumph dealer, I can tell you that about 8 years ago, Triumph North America figured out that they could boost profits in the short term by channeling all their efforts on selling more bikes to dealers. This was contrary to continuing to build the Triumph brand, particularly in bikes that were outside of that retro classic line, like the Bonneville or Thruxton. This plan came from a fellow named Greg Heichelbach, who was CEO of Triumph North America at the time. Heichelbach joined the company after a 10-year stint at Buell and Harley-Davidson in a marketing and sales business development role. So along with Heichelbach came Matthew Shahan as VP of Sales for North America. Shahan also came from Buell Motorcycles. And if there's one thing that Buell Motorcycles knew how to do, was build a brand. Now, I don't have time here to discuss the continued demise of Harley-Davidson, perhaps another time. So Heichelbach and Shahan instituted a new stocking program for Triumph dealers. It required them to stock at least one of whatever the current model year was of every motorcycle Triumph made year-round, while restricting more than one stock motorcycle on popular models like the Speed 3 or the Thruxton, often holding these bikes hostage to leverage the dealer's compliance on the every bike stocking order. Now, this was a year-round stocking program, so for northern dealers that have to deal with 6 months of snow and ice, they also had to stock a full line of Triumph motorcycle inventory even in November. Triumph went so far as to forcibly swap inventory between dealers if one dealer had the misfortune of, say, having more than one Thunderbird, which was an overpriced cruiser no one really wanted, and they would force that onto a dealer who was perhaps fortunate enough to have sold theirs. This stocking program was model year specific. So what that meant was that even if you had a previous year's Thunderbird or Rocket 3 Touring or Triumph Sprint, it didn't count towards the next year. And what this meant is that soon as January 1st rolled around, Triumph was ready and waiting to send you another one. And believe me, I can tell you, they did it. When this program was announced, it also came with a companion program based around Triumph apparel. And Triumph would bonus dealers for compliance. What that meant is that a lot of dealers wound up stocking far more Triumph apparel and motorcycle inventory than they normally would have been comfortable with. This program was combined with the launch of Triumph's own apparel sales website that cut the dealer out of Triumph gear sales.
Now, Triumph was never a strong enough brand to stand on its own in a motorcycle shop in North America. Typically, dealers had multiple lines of motorcycles. In the shop that I managed, we had 7 motorcycle lines both on and off-road. The amount of effort now required to manage the inventory from a relatively small player in the motorcycle scheme of things was an enormous drain on resources. We were also a BMW, Ducati, Kawasaki, Suzuki dealer who I consider major street bike players that combined made up about 95% of our motorcycle volume. while the first 3 brands made up almost 100% of motorcycle profitability on sales. We kept our Triumph franchise, seeking out the loopholes to help us manage through the apparel stock, and wheeled and dealed our way through the more popular Triumph motorcycle stock, selling the less popular machines at a loss just to recover the floor plan margin that we needed and hopefully earn some potential parts and service business. But many dealers didn't fare as well. Some across North America gave up their Triumph franchise within weeks of this plan coming out. Others had it ruin their business as mom and pop shops could not keep up with the Triumph legalese requirements of the brand. What followed was a massive dumping of Triumph motorcycles into the secondary market. Triumph North America sold brand new motorcycles at auction to the highest bidder, devaluing their inventory already at dealerships and perpetuating a brutal cycle of screwing over their dealers. Now, Greg Heichelbach left Triumph in 2014. When asked how exactly Heichelbach left, if he was fired or resigned, Triumph North America reiterated that he was no longer with the company and wouldn't elaborate. Heichelbach left a legacy of channel stuffing Triumph dealers and having less dealers at the end of his reign than when he started. Matthew Shahan was now to take over Triumph North America from his COO position. Shahan stayed at Triumph until 2018 when he publicly resigned, and privately Triumph suggests he was fired. Shahan now works as a VP of marketing in a retail, multi-dealer, Harley-Davidson-focused sales group based out of Chicago. Heichelbach has had a few jobs since he's left Triumph, but now he's the CEO of Kuriak and Accessories. Okay, I'm going to take 1 foot off the soapbox here. Triumph fell into a position where it had lost sight of why people bought their motorcycles in the first place. Now, that's something oddly that Harley-Davidson built an empire on in the 1980s and 90s, but Heichelbach and Shahan forgot when they left the company. Brand and lifestyle sell motorcycles. Devaluing Triumph's brand in North America is something you just can't afford to do. Sowing ill between manufacturers and dealers is also something you don't do. Many dealers spoke publicly and vocally to their customers about the changes at Triumph, which forced them out of their franchise or in some cases out of business. So where does this leave Triumph now? With fewer lines and less choice for what's left of their enthusiasts since the start of the Hinckley era. Rehashing the most popular lines and stuffing every bike with the 1200cc triple they can. An engine, frankly, when compared to other 1200s and now 1250s and 1300cc offerings Triumph competitors have, is completely underwhelming at 89 brake horsepower in the Classic line and only 141 horsepower and 90 foot-pounds torque in the Tiger. That's only a 10% increase in horsepower and a 12% increase in torque than the 1050 engine. Now, I've ridden both the Bobber and the Tiger 1200 and can say that I would not recommend either of them. The new 1200 Speed Triple is supposed to make 177 brake horsepower, and according to their website is only 14 pounds or less than 6.5 kilos heavier. So maybe Triumph figured out how to up their game with this engine, but a 200 horsepower naked sport bike, is there that big of a market for it? I don't know. Would you spend over $18,000 US on this bike? Put your answer in the comments below. Okay, fully off the soapbox, I am interested to see how Triumph's electric bike program develops. Although not immediately appealing to me, electric motorcycles will be the future of riding someday. So to wrap things up, we're back with our 2 sprints. As I mentioned earlier, they are often overlooked in the secondary market, meaning that they're fantastic values, especially when compared to the BMW K12 or 1300S, Yamaha FJR or Kawasaki Concourse 1400. The bike is a potent package overall, and well worth upgrading the horrible brakes in the aftermarket. The Triumph Triple sounds awesome and is a pleasure to ride, so my recommendation is if you can find an ST or a GT, buy it. You won't be disappointed.